Hello everybody, I'm Lisa.
And I'm Nick.
And welcome to It Takes Two, a podcast where two people take two movies with the same plot or premise and watch and discuss them.
And in this week's episode, we watched I, Robot and Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Now, you might be saying to yourselves, those are not the same movie, but I would argue that they are.
Yeah, and here's why. The following is why.
No, I'll just do, because we'll go over it more as we go through the episode, but the best way to describe either of these movies to make it confusing as to which movie you're describing is they are about a detective who is prejudiced against a certain type of entity and then gets involved in a murder investigation because of his prejudice of that type of entity, suspects that it is one of that type of entity, and then ends up figuring out that it's not quite who he originally thought.
Yeah, so in I, Robot, but the character that he assumes is the murderer is Sonny, and then in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, it's Roger Rabbit.
Yeah, they're both pretty obvious, because obviously one is a robot, and the other is in the title of the movie, Roger Rabbit.
Yeah.
So
That's the similarities. Now we'll go into the differences.
No, there's a lot of differences. Yeah, so but the main starting out is that we have it's Detective Dill Spooner, I believe is his name.
Is his name first name Dill?
I think they just call him Spooner for most of the movie. I'm pretty sure at one point someone called him Dill.
Okay.
So I think his name is Dill Spooner, which is an interesting name.
You'd think we would have looked that up.
Yeah, and he hates robots.
Yeah.
And in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, we have Eddie Valiant, who hates toons. So in the world of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, toons are real, and they, cartoons are live-action films of toon actors.
Which is super bizarre, because that's how the opening starts off. Yeah,
it starts off with a Looney Tunes style cartoon, and then it cuts out to, you discover that it's the toons are actors and they're on a set and they've got human directors who are like, no, you're supposed to make stars, not birds.
Yeah.
And then we pan out to Eddie Valiant. So the way they show these prejudices are different. So in I, Robot, it's very show, and in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, it's kind of tell.
Yeah.
Because in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you literally see, Roger talking to his director, and he's all whiny and whatever, and Eddie Valiant is off to the side drinking alcohol, and he, mutters under his breath, and he's like, ugh, toons, basically. So that's your introduction to him, is, wow, he hates toons.
Yeah, the characters differ between Spooner and Valiant, because Spooner's coming off rehabilitation from a car accident, which is where he picked up, I'm assuming, in the story, most of his prejudice towards robots. He's come off sabbatical from work, from being a detective with the Chicago police force, or whatever the moniker is in that. He's undergone surgery, where he gets to know the victim, which was Professor Lanning.
I believe Lanning. I'll double check what I've written down.
And, there's the intro to his character, you see him working out and having a shower, which is, he's got a nice ass in this movie. I can say that as a straight man. I literally have a note that says nice ass Will.
I didn't even notice it. We're both looking at different places.
Yeah, he's into retro shoes, which he wears Converse All-Stars that was circa 1994.
No, 2004.
2004, sorry.
Yeah, vintage 2004. Which is when the movie was released.
See, with Valiant, on the other hand, his introduction is he's gone from you don't get it straight away because it goes a little bit into his backstory, but him and his brother Teddy were, hotshot detectives within the police, and
I don't know if they were. I think they were private investigators.
They were private investigators afterwards, and
okay.
They were the only ones that ever worked with toons as human investigators.
So Eddie's story is interesting because he was known as a human investigator who would work with toons and take cases of toons and help toons. But at this point, when we meet him, he hates Toons and he's prejudiced against them because, as we find out later in the movie, a Toon killed his brother.
Yeah, and he's basically circling down the drain. You know, he's broke. His relationship with, obviously, the love interest in this movie is quite strained, and he's become a raging alcoholic to the point where he walks into a room, sees the bottle of liquor, and goes straight to it.
Yeah, it's interesting because the relationship with Dolores, I think when she's introduced first, I don't think it's ever said. I just assumed they were divorced, but then they're clearly not, and they're both still in love with each other, and I don't know where they ever married, and they've separated, or if they just were in a romantic relationship. But yeah, it's interesting because obviously that evolves over the course of the movie as well.
Yeah, because you get that in the beginning was they're showing the prejudice rather than telling like you do in Roger Rabbit and Valiant, where Spooner sees a robot running down the street with a purse and it automatically assumes that it's committing a crime of theft, and ends up chasing it and then getting in trouble with his superior John, his lieutenant. Yeah,
and even then we don't have him say, "You do this all the time." What he says to him is, he asks what happens, and he says, "Oh, it was nothing."
Yeah.
And his lieutenant says, "It better be the last nothing."
Yeah.
So we now know this is a recurring incident, that he regularly assumes robots are committing crimes, even though, as far as anyone else knows in this movie, robots are incapable of committing crime.
Yeah, it's interesting because both the characters, Spooner and Valiant, are clearly not over the triggering fact that gained their prejudice.
Yeah.
Spooner with a recurring nightmare of being in the car and being in the water, and the little girl dying in front of him, and him being rescued over the little girl. And, as he says to Calvin later on in the movie, a human would have made the decision to pick the girl over me.
Yeah, so he says it was, I think he had a 44% chance of survival and the girl had an 11% chance.
Yeah.
And what he says is 11% is more than enough. A human being would have known that.
Yeah.
Because basically in his mind, she is someone's little girl and she deserves saving more than he deserves saving.
Yeah.
And 11% was enough of a chance to try to save her.
Obviously, the settings are very different. You've got, with iRobot, it's a very cyberpunk-esque. We've got cyborgs, we've got robots, we've got the same sort of city design where transit networks have been placed over the top of existing networks because the development is faster, the infrastructure that can handle. You've got the old school, stone buildings, brick buildings, concrete buildings next to these giant brand new skyscrapers. Versus Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is a sort of set in a period of time, which is 1974.
No, 1947.
No, I literally have 1947 written down, and I said 74.
You still said 74.
Yeah, I think I've been watching too many AK videos.
We've accidentally uncovered here the fact that this isn't our first time recording this episode. Yeah. We had some technical difficulties, so we're re-recording.
Yeah.
But last time you also said 1974 when it's clearly set in 1947.
I know, and I've got 1947 written down. So yeah, there's period accurate cars, the costumes, the city looks as it would have in 47.
Yeah, it's set up to look like a film noir, and that's the whole. It's to bring you into that world. It's basically using these kind of signal cues that your brain, if you've seen any film noir movies, will go, "Oh, this is a film noir. This is going to be a detective story. There's going to be a mystery,"
And there's also another base settings which have got the bar that Dolores works in used to be a speakeasy.
Yeah.
And, so that would have been, what was it,
1920 to 1933, I think, was Prohibition.
So that's that same aesthetic there.
And we've got, obviously, Jessica Rabbit as a bit of our femme fatale.
Yeah.
It's another, classic.
Who's now replaced Betty Boop as, like, the in... I wouldn't even... It's not even I don't know. She's the new
Performer. Cartoon performer.
Yeah.
She's at a humans only bar.
Yeah.
So it's... I mean, the setup for Who Framed Roger Rabbit is Valiant is brought in to investigate or to get pictures of Jessica cheating, because Roger's boss, who is Maroon, who's the head of
Maroon Studios.
Yeah, Maroon Studios, one of the cartoon studios in Hollywood at the time, wants to get Roger's head back on track because Roger is doing bad at his job. So Valiant finds he doesn't want to go to. We learn then he doesn't want to go to Toontown. He refuses to go to Toontown.
Yeah.
And they say that's fine because Jessica works in a human-only bar.
Yeah, and it goes back to it's based on a real bar that was set during segregation, which the bar was in a predominantly African-American neighborhood with African-American wait staff and performers, yet it was a white-only bar. Yeah. And it's the exact same thing, except everything's run by tunes, except it's a human-only bar.
Yeah, so you get your penguin waiters, you've got Donald and Daffy Duck playing a piano duet on stage, you've got people behind the bar are cartoons, and then Jessica Rabbit comes out, and it's real creepy because you get like Acme, who's the head of the other studio in town, like showing up to watch Jessica do this, basically like it's not quite a striptease, but it's like
it's more cabaret.
Yeah, a little bit cabaret. It's supposed to be very like sultry. Yeah. And what Betty Boop says to Eddie is that Acme never misses a night that Jessica's on stage, and it becomes very creepy because obviously they are making a commentary on segregation and racism and prejudice, and iRobot does as well, and it's interesting because obviously in iRobot, your main character, who is the person who is prejudiced, is a black man. Yeah. So that's an interesting choice to have made, and his lieutenant is a black man. Yeah. So yeah, I'd be interested to know why they actually, or if that was a conscious decision to cast a black actor as your main, as the racist of the movie, essentially. Yeah,
that's an interesting take, because it sort of shows that it's become, in the same with Valiant, it becomes sort of like it's not really speciesism, because I don't think tunes are a species, but like it's that you can have prejudice without it just being based on race. And there's a few other, I think, Alien Nation, and there's a few others that I can remember, but I just can't remember the names of, where it's literally, racism is just shown through different species rather than...
Yeah, District 9 is a big one.
Yeah, District 9 is a really good one.
Yeah. Because, obviously that was making a very big statement about South Africa in particular.
Yeah, because there's segments, I'm just going to go on a tangent here, there's segments in District 9 where they literally asked people on the street about their opinions of immigrants into their area from other countries, and the reactions that they get are legitimate hatred. Yeah. And they just changed it, so they're talking about the aliens in District 9.
Yeah. I think that's what they did for because did they do I think they did a short first? Yeah. And then made a feature film. And I think for the short, they literally just interviewed people about, like, actual people, and then made it sound like they were talking about aliens. Yeah. So it's a really interesting way to do it. Anyway, we're not here to talk about District 9. No. Great movie, though. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it.
Because I don't think there's anything that's matches District 9 that would fit.
No.
On the other, so we've covered how Valiant gets into this the plot, and with Spooner, he's contacted by a video will that was left over by Lanning on the event of his death, and it's a very simple holographic thing you can only answer sort of closed questions to, and it will respond back to you. So it's just sort of starts off this trail of breadcrumbs, because they use the Hansel and Gretel analogy quite a lot. Yeah. And to the point where literally a copy of Hansel and Gretel is next to the broken window that he's thrown himself through. You learn that he's sort of been a recluse and held up within the building, lead up to the new release of these new robots that are going to replace the old ones. I think the sort of that's the sort of catalyst that gets him sort of trying to be a detective and investigate who killed him, where everybody else is just like literally signing off as a suicide.
Yeah, so it's kind of passed off as a suicide, but Lanning had specifically set up this like electronic will to contact Spooner directly in the event of his death. And Spooner is a homicide detective with a prejudice against robots.
Yeah.
So at that time, he's like, well, why do you contact a homicide detective if it's whatever? But there's a moment later on where some other stuff happens, and you know, his boss, his chief, the lieutenant, says to him like, oh, you know, what are the odds that if a robot did do this, you're the one to find it? And then he kind of realizes, wait, it might not just be because I'm a homicide detective, it might be because of my prejudice against robots. He's trying to point me toward the robot.
Yeah. There's some interesting sort of, what's the easiest way to put it? There's interesting religious elements that are sort of, from my point of view, I was picked up. There's a conversation between when they're investigating Lanning's room after he sees the book, Hansel and Gretel, and you know, no one came in, no one came out, so therefore the killer must be in the room. And she's like, well, the only person would have been a robot, and they can't because of the three laws, you know, be the same as a human walking on water. And Spooner's response is, well, one guy did once.
Yeah.
And later on in the movie, there's a little bit more iconography from Catholicism that I find interesting because it's sort of like, you know, the Messiah complex.
Yeah.
You get this, how big of an operation USR, did I get that right this time?
Yep.
Yeah, USR.
I think it's just United States Robotics.
Yeah, USR, how massive their infrastructure is and how much everybody relies on these robots. You know, it's the racism shown in it. Well, we'd call it racism because, you know, AI controlled robots don't exist in our world yet. They're doing all the menial tasks. You know, they're your couriers, they're your personal assistants, they're your garbage men.
Yeah, it's very much, and that's very much highlighted right at the beginning of the movie, where it's, you know, the delivery man and then the bin truck and the, you know, and then it's like when people just have them as like personal servants.
Yeah.
So even the one that he chases down with the purse belongs to this woman, and she had sent it running to go get her purse because
she was
forgot
having
it.
an asthma attack.
Yeah.
And she's also African American as well, which is sort of ramming it home, rather than spoon feeding.
I think that might be just a little bit of realism because I think he just visited his grandmother, so I think he was in a black neighborhood.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it makes sense that the people that he runs into are also African American.
Yeah.
But again, it is interesting that, you know, it is, you know, a black woman with a slave essentially.
Yeah. When he arrives at USR, he also is introduced to Vicky, who's their like big AI core, which is in control of majority of the infrastructure that's running the city.
Yep.
She's got like a surveillance strip that runs through everywhere where she can see at all times and later on project herself out of. And they're helping with the investigation, which is also comes up as very suspicious when it's like, can you show me the feed from in the room? And it's all deleted.
Corrupted is what she says.
Yeah, corrupted.
Corrupted. Conveniently corrupted.
Yeah, which is intriguing. The introduction to Sonny, which is the special robot that Lanning had built.
So he's the first of the NS5s to be active, it seems to be.
Yeah.
Because they haven't been rolled out yet, but this one is in... we meet him, he's in the room that Lanning was, you know, leapt from the window in.
And it shows quite early on that he doesn't follow the three laws of robotics.
Yeah, so Spooner tries to attack him, and then Dr. Calvin, who is, I think she's an assistant to Lanning.
she's I think the description that she gives was that she makes them more human by integrating wet work with software.
Right, that makes sense. Which she obviously has quite a close relationship with him because we see later on that there's photos of her and Lanning together and things. But yeah, so she tells Sonny to deactivate, and he appears to deactivate, but then when Spooner approaches them with a gun, Sonny reacts. And then we realize that he is able to bypass the three laws. I just realized we haven't actually gone over what the three laws are. So the three laws of robotics are: a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings except where such orders conflict with the first law, and a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. So the fact that he's not obeying her order shows that he's able to ignore those 3 rules. And those 3 rules are, in everyone's mind, what keeps robots subservient.
Yeah. Jumping over to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you show that toons can take a ridiculous amount of punishment, having the sequence in the beginning, in the opening, where Roger gets hit repeatedly in the fridge, hit in the head with a fridge, and that the introduction of Judge Doom, who's played by Christopher Lloyd. Christopher Lloyd. I was going to say Christopher Lee.
No, it's not Christopher Lee. Though he, I believe, was one of the considerations.
Yes. And he's figured out a way to kill toons, which was a mixture of... you had the list.
Yeah, I had the actual thing here somewhere.
Acetone.
Yeah, no, it was turpentine.
Turpentine.
And we're missing the third one. Oh, I've got so many notes for this movie, though.
Yeah, we both do.
Yeah, no, but I mean, so many copied over from IMDb, like...
Oh, right, yeah.
Just because there's just so much that happens in this movie. Where have I written that? Oh, yeah, so dip... Oh, no. Never mind, I just saw the word dip and got excited, but it wasn't the right note. Dip.
So Judge Doom's the person who works with the toons, and he hates them as much as Valiant does, but in a different way.
Yeah, benzene is in. So turpentine, acetone, and benzene. So they're all paint thinners that are used to remove images from cells.
Yeah.
So we haven't actually gotten to the murder investigation of this. So initially, Valiant is brought into this whole thing because he's hired to take pictures of Jessica. When they show that to Roger, Roger gets upset, and then the next morning, Eddie finds out that Acme has been killed, and Roger is the suspect. So this is...
Because of the way he dies as well, which is he had a safe dropped on his head.
Yeah, he had a safe dropped on his head, which means it's, killed by a toon.
Yeah.
And Roger was known to be angry at him, because of the Jessica situation, so...
I really like that sequence when they show Roger the photos of him and his wife and Acme playing patty cake, and he moves the frame so quickly that it becomes like animation.
It's like a real flipbook style, so it's very clever because obviously
that's how animation was done.
That's how animation is done in real life, and in the universe of the film, it's not how animation is done because animation is shot on film. So it's very clever that he flips through the photos as if they're a flipbook, and you can see them playing patty cake.
Then he goes over the other photos and he sees, the relationship he had with Dolores, and he sort of reminisces about his brother. And then we sort of jump forward to where they're looking for Roger. I think Baby Herman, who's like one of Roger's co-stars, turns up, who's a 50-year-old toon, but, as a baby.
Yeah, he looks like a baby, but he smokes a cigar and he's 50 years old.
Yeah, and he's telling... Valiant that Roger didn't do it.
So he claims that he was framed. He says that Acme was planning to leave the whole of Toontown to the toons in his will, and that no will was found with the body, and also no toon would have killed him knowing that he was going to leave Toontown to them. So there's no way that Roger's done it. He's saying Roger's been framed. Eddie doesn't believe him, but then he notices in the photo of Acme on the newspaper, he's got the will in his pocket.
Yeah. Which was in the released photos from his investigation and the stuff that they showed Roger.
Yeah.
So when he goes back, Roger's in his apartment / office / everything, and he handcuffs himself to him because he had a reputation of being the only person that ever helped toons.
Also, it's just fantastic technique for forcing them to really continue, really go the extra mile with combining the animation with the live action. That you've got the live action character and the animated character literally handcuffed to each other. So you've got that prop handcuff that they have to match up the animation with.
Yeah. There was a lot of direction on Bob Hoskins' part, who plays, I guess the rest of the actors, as well as how they interacted directly with the toons. But obviously you get a lot of close-ups with Roger and Valiant, where literally he had to make sure that his hand, when he was gripping Roger, was closed, so the animators didn't have to animate between his fingers. You get the sort of slapstickness of everything, because it ends up, Roger can move very violently and very quickly, sort of defying the laws of physics, where obviously Valiant's not able to do that, and he gets dragged around quite a lot. And there's like scenes where the water splashes, and Roger's interacting with live action items, which are fantastic.
Yeah, and there's literally a term in animation that comes from this movie, and it's bump the lamp, because at one point in the movie there's a scene where they accidentally knock a lamp on the ceiling as they walk in, so the lamp starts swinging, which makes all the shadows move around the room, which meant that when the animators had to match up to the live action footage, they had to add in all these extra shadows and make sure that it moved with the light. So nowadays in animation they use the term bump the lamp to refer to just going the extra mile to add an effect that will make everything more special and more real, even if the audience aren't going to notice that they've done it.
Yeah.
I feel like a big example of that for me that's actually not animation is What We Do in the Shadows, because the most expensive shot in What We Do in the Shadows was where they're just sitting around the dinner table, and it's because they had to go in and hand erase all of their reflections in the table.
Oh, yeah.
And probably no one would have noticed if they had left the reflections on the table.
Yeah.
But they went in and erased all of the reflections in the table of the vampires.
That's the same sequence where they do that like challenge off and they both raise up against the roof, right?
I think it's the one where they do the Paschetti. I think it's the scene where they've got all the people over and they turn the spaghetti into worms.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Another fantastic movie. If you haven't seen it, watch it. We have nothing to compare that to though, because it's very one of a kind.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so I think it's interesting then, obviously in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, they filmed everything live action. They use a lot of props where they had to like time the movement of props to then match up animation to it afterwards.
Yeah.
In iRobot, they use the same technique that they use for Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, so it's all motion capture for the robots.
Yeah.
So I think they had a lot of stuntmen doing a whole lot of the NS5s. And then for Sonny, it is Alan Tudyk himself doing the mocap, doing the facial animation, or he is physically acting and emoting, and then also doing the voice. So they took big inspiration from the process that they used for Gollum, and just did the same thing with Alan Tudyk.
There's quite a few quotes that I really enjoy from iRobot that I quote far too much. But one of them that I really find out when he goes to Lanning's house and he realizes that he hasn't been there for a long time, and he checks there's a demolition robot outside, and checks it, and then obviously someone hacks into it and reprograms it to demo the house while he's inside. But there's a sequence where he comes across Lanning's cat, and he's like, he sits down and looks at the cat, and he's like, "You're a cat, I'm black, I'm not going to be hurt again." And then it sort of blows at that moment where after the demo of the house and he surfs the front door out into the water feature and escapes from the demo robot, he goes to see Calvin, and he asks, "Do you like cats?" And he's like, "Cat." She's like, "Cats did this to you?" It's like, "No, do cats look like they can do this to me?" He's all covered in blood and dust and stuff.
Yeah. One of my favourite quotes from the whole movie is actually slightly before that. It's after when they find Sonny first, he goes on the run, and then they eventually, through whatever they catch him. They end up bringing him to the police station, and that's when his boss is like, the odds that you would be the one to find him, and that's when that happens. That's when he goes off to Lanning's house.
Yeah.
But when Sonny is at the police station, Spooner has a few minutes to interview him before his lawyers show up. And when he goes in, he's talking to him, and he's, Sonny is telling him how his father was teaching him emotions, and, he's trying to become more human, basically. And Spooner says to him, "Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece?" And Sonny's response is just, "Can you?"
Yeah, which is a sick burn.
Oh, it's so good. And he doesn't mean it as a burn, but Spooner's just, so annoyed by it. Whereas Sonny is genuinely asking it, I think.
Yeah.
Because he's very sincere.
Yeah.
I find that everything Sonny says is very sincere. He's almost childlike, but not quite.
Yeah, because he's about to sort of start confessing to Spooner in that interview sequence when USR and their lawyers and CEO Robertson.
Yeah, because Spooner gets him angry and he like slams down on the table.
I did not murder him.
Yeah, and then Spooner's like, that one's called anger. Yeah. Have you done that one before? And then Sonny says to him, or Sonny starts. I think that's where Spooner starts to suddenly see things differently, because Sonny starts to just like talk to himself and he starts to blame himself for the death anyway, because he's like he wanted to die, he killed himself. He's like, I thought he was happy. Was it something I did? Did I do something wrong? And Spooner's kind of going, oh, okay. And that's when you're saying he's almost confessed to him, because what he said to him was, you have to do what someone asks you to do. Don't you, detective? And he's like, what do you mean? He's like, you have to do what someone asks you to do if you love them. Yeah, and
then the doors open and they're, getting
and then his lawyers come in and tell him that it can't be a murder because murder is defined as a human killing another human.
Yeah, which the lieutenant quotes later, because he's talking about, that I remember the good old days where it was only people that killed people. Going forward and back in this movie, because that's what I like doing, because I never make it easy for the listeners at home. The sequence that I really enjoy in this movie, because both movies have car chases, which is another simple. There's heaps of movies, like what was it we watched recently that was fantastic?
What's Up, Doc?
What's Up, Doc has the best car chase sequence, and then I find a lot of movies just plug one in there. Yeah. Like I remember Babylon AD having a car chase sequence where it clearly didn't need it. It was so bizarre. But anyway, car chase sequence where he's in his cool Audi, which has got the round wheels, and I always wanted to look into, because it was a concept to make them more. It was Audi.
Yeah, Audi made the movie, or made that car for the movie. Yeah. And it was to try and like get more empathy for their brand or something. I don't know, it's phrased weirdly in the notes. Yeah, the car design, and again, I'd look at, it's like Minority Report for like a futuristic car design, but these will really stand out of my mind, because I don't know how you would physically propel circular wheels. Spherical wheels.
Spherical, thank you.
Yeah, most wheels are circular.
All wheels are circular.
If you have a non-circular wheel, you have a problem.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of concepts around, because wheel technology hasn't changed that much in comparison to how much cars have changed. There's still rubber, they've still got inflatable internal bladders, that sort of thing, where this new concept of completely spherical wheels is quite interesting, because then you show later on that cars are able to drive still forward as in with their trajectory, but also not forward as
so the car is like driving sideways essentially. Yeah. And also he spins around it during
that's the car sequence. I really like that quote, because he gets ambushed by two NS5 cargo vessels that are carrying.
Yeah, so there's been other stuff in the meantime. So I think at this point he has changed his mind and doesn't believe Sonny did it and believes the corporation are behind things.
Yeah. The finger goes from being Sonny to now being USR.
Yeah. Which is how he ends up in this car chase sequence. Yeah. Because he's trying to go to USR at this point. And yeah, and so these big supply trucks or whatever of the NS5, one goes in front of him, one goes behind him, and again they turn sideways and block off the whole tunnel. And then one of the NS5s, it opens up and you can see all the NS5s, and then he's just like,
no one's this unlucky.
Yeah. And then the NS5, one of them jumps out of it, lands on his car, smashes through his windscreen, and just says, you are experiencing a car accident.
He's like, yeah, hell I am, and shoots it, and then the cool sequence runs. And then we get a sequence where, his expert driving, including doing like I don't even know, more than 900, spinning in his car, and he gets away from the two trucks, and the two trucks crash and explode, and then he's in a car accident, and there's a fantastic audio design in there where you follow in where it all gets blown out and then all comes back in, and you get the tinnitus feeling.
Yeah, I think it's really, really, really well done, because they'd use all contact mics, so it's only the sound of whatever he's touching that you can hear. It's the same way they did the audio in the beginning of Gravity. Yeah. And it's this real feeling of there's no proper sound, so you feel like you've lost your hearing, and as it starts to come back, they design it with this ringing so that you feel like you've got tinnitus as your hearing is coming back. So you experience that accident with him.
Yeah, and then obviously one of the surviving robots from the crashes attacks him, and then you find out that Spooner's actually a cyborg, and one of his arms is cybernetic, and they have like a standoff fight, and the robot's only got one arm, so it's basically one arm versus one arm. And then when the police arrive, it destroys itself. And there's another quote in here that I quote way too much, which is when the lieutenant asks him, you know, what the hell happened, and he's like, "The goddamn robots, John." And it's like, what? There aren't any. Like, they're all gone. Like,
yeah, so they purposely destroyed the evidence to make him seem paranoid.
Yeah, because just from their point of view, all he's done is run two transport trucks off the road.
And this is after multiple times where he has, in the past, believed robots were committing crimes when they weren't. So it's very boy who cried wolf.
Yeah. And because of this, he gets suspended. And then, you know, a lot of his resources are gone.
Yeah, so this is the reason he was going there in the first place, is he had accessed restricted files to try and find out... Because he had seen the breadcrumbs left for him in Lanning's house.
Yeah.
So then he accessed some restricted files to figure out, you know, what those breadcrumbs could be. So we have that scene where we have him watching the interviews or whatever, and Lanning saying, you know, one day they'll have secrets, one day they'll have dreams.
Yeah.
And it's Robertson, who is the CEO of USR, had requested to receive notification if anyone accessed restricted files.
Yeah.
And that's you immediately see him do that, and then you immediately see those trucks pull up and
yeah, because it's very, the movie itself is pointing the bad guy to being the CEO.
Yeah, the movie wants us to believe that Robertson is behind everything.
Back in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, when Valiant goes to confront Maroon, because he's now going to have majority control, he explains to Valiant after a fight sequence that, you know, no, it's not me, it's someone, that he's about to say it, and then he gets shot in the back with quite a long revolver.
Yeah.
When Valiant gets up and runs to the window, you see Jessica Rabbit running away, so therefore the movie's trying to make you think that Jessica is the bad. Yeah.
We get two car chases in Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yeah.
Because the first one we get is when Eddie was hiding Roger in the speakeasy, and Doom comes in and discovers that he's there. They run and they find...
In the back of the Weasel's truck, we find Benny, who's like a New York City cab cartoon.
So they drive away on him, and then the Weasels drive after them, and there's a whole car chase sequence.
The fantastic part of that sequence is, it's like he's got one car behind him, one car, and they're like in a very tight alleyway, so there's no way they could pass. And it's like, pull the lever. It's like, what lever? Because he's looking at all these controls, and then you see a arrow sign come out and pointing at a lever, and it's like, this lever, stupid. Yeah. And he pulls the lever, and it does that like whole...
it goes up on stilts, kind of, So that's how he escapes the car chase, where he's sandwiched between two cars. Whereas Spooner drives up along the wall. He does kind of the same thing. I think he does it in Men in Black as well. Yeah. Where he drives up along the wall to get over them.
Yeah.
But he ends up in a crash, whereas Benny doesn't.
Yeah.
And then our second car chase is the one you're talking about, where Eddie tries to chase Jessica. So he goes out. He had Roger minding his car, but when he goes out, Roger's gone. It turns out Jessica has hit Roger over the head with a frying pan and stuck him in the boot of her car.
Yeah.
So then he chases Jessica, and she goes into Toontown, and he stops the car because he doesn't want to set foot in Toontown.
Yeah, and it's that fantastic sequence there, because he pulls out a gift that was given to him by I was going to say Speedy Gonzales. It's not Speedy Gonzales. Yosemite Sam, and it's a toon gun with like cowboy bullets.
Yeah. I don't think we actually mentioned this yet. This movie has Disney characters and Warner Brothers characters like working together in this toon industry.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of borrowed characters in it.
Because there's a sequence with the parachute as well.
Yeah, where he's got Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse parachuting, and he's just walked out of a building and fallen.
Yeah.
And they offer him a spare tire.
Yeah. Classic gag.
Yes, there's a lot of gags.
And it's that point in time where Valiant changes his mindset. You know, he's got his, I guess it was a service weapon.
Yeah, it must be.
And then he reaches into his coat and pulls out a bottle of, I think he's a Scotch drinker. And it's he, instead of drinking it, he just pours it out. And then he gets in the car to, you know, go into Toontown. And the entrance into Toontown would be an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, you'd immediately crash your car.
Yeah, because he goes in and you go from driving on this road and it has the opening of the curtain. And, this, you know, from the point of view is it's at night. And then when he drives into Toontown, it's day and there's singing trees and dancing animals.
The sun is singing and everything's bright. There's birds flying through his car.
And it's the exact point in time where he ends up crashing into the escape vehicle that Jessica had.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much a sensory overload as you go in there. Yeah, so there's like a weird decoy thing where someone dressed as Jessica and it's not Jessica, it's kind of irrelevant. But he does end up finding Jessica. But he finds her because she shows up with a gun, but it turns out she's shooting at someone behind him, not at him.
And then we get the escape out of Toontown with Benny again, and then the weasel set up a dip trap on the other side, so it ends up like
melting Benny's wheels, basically.
Melting Benny's wheels. And then they get taken, and then you see Roger turn up, and he's in Valiant's car, and it's scratched to the living. It's almost destroyed.
Yeah.
Borderline non-drivable. And then Benny gets in and ends up being the driver because it's like, move over, you've done enough driving for today.
Yeah.
So you have a car driving a car.
Yeah, it's a great moment.
Because they used a go-kart for Benny, right?
Yeah, it's like a shell-less go-kart, so it's just like the innards of a go-kart, basically. Yeah. And they reused that then in Back to the Future 2, I think, or maybe 3. They filmed them at the same time, but it's one of those sequences where Marty McFly is trailing behind a vehicle on his hoverboard, and he's actually trailing behind the Benny go-kart for some of those shots.
The reveal of the main bad guy in both the movies sort of happens similar at the same point. We have, they go to see, so basically there's a sequence where he goes through and sees that after they interview Sonny again, and he's sort of got Calvin on his side, Spooner's got Calvin on his side, he goes to see where see Sonny, and Sonny does this amazing animation where he's drawing only vertical and horizontal lines, but in like dot matrix-esque animation with both hands.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fantastic because I don't think, a human being wouldn't be able to do that. And there's no straight, no curved lines in it. It's fantastic because he's talking about his Sonny's dream, which is one of the clues that's been hidden by Lanning, of this image of where the storage center for all the NS4s is, which is in the old dried up lake bed of Lake Michigan.
Yep.
Which is where again he finds a plaque that says what does it say? It says what you see here. What you see here, which was the opening of Lanning's message.
Yeah, the opening of Lanning's message. So when he opens Lanning's message first, it's beside Lanning's dead body, and it's everything that follows is a result of what you see here.
Yeah.
And that's our first breadcrumb. So when he finally goes out there and he sees that that's written there, he puts down
the disc again.
Yeah, and he asks it some more questions. And one of the things he asks it is, he asks it about the robots or whatever, or the 3 laws, and it says, the 3 laws will come to an inevitable conclusion. And he says, what is that conclusion? Revolution.
Yeah, and for whom? And that detective is the right question.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
So you see the NS5s destroying the NS4s, and the NS4s end up saving Spooner from the NS5s.
Yeah, one of them comes up, that's been ripped in half, and it crawls over to him to say, you were in danger.
Yeah.
And then the rest of them start jumping out to stop the NS5s and because they know that they're going to hurt Spooner and they're trying to protect a human.
And the thing, the difference between them is when they've got this glowing red light in their chest is when they're connected to the mainframe.
To the uplink.
To the uplink, yeah. Sorry.
So he believes at this point that Robertson is controlling them through the uplink.
So we have the next sequence goes through where you have Shia LaBeouf again.
Well, first there's a sequence in Calvin's house because Spooner calls her and starts to tell her, but she's in the shower, and that's a real sign of vulnerability in movies, to put someone in the shower, and she hears the phone go, and she steps out, and she hears the beginning of the message where he's saying, he's telling her what's happened, and her NS5 that she has in her house just deletes the message.
Yeah, and it says, who was that on the phone? Wrong number, ma'am. And she's like, oh, crap.
Yeah.
I really like the technology because you see, after his car's blown up, he's using a motorcycle. Mm-hmm. Again, probably in regards to his character enjoying retro-esque technology.
Yeah, and not trusting robots.
He's got the AR goggles, like sunglasses on, which show him with the traffic, because that's the other thing about these new futuristic cars is the speed they're travelling. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
She makes comment of it as well when she's driving in the Audi of like, you shouldn't be driving manually. Like, you can't drive manually at the speed.
At the speed, yeah.
Because I think they were going like 170 miles per hour.
I don't know. It's something ridiculous, yeah. Yeah. So then a whole lot of the USR trucks full of the NS5s show up on the streets, and they step out and they try to enforce the curfew.
Yeah.
And it's, they're saying we are attempting to prevent human losses during this transition. So it is a coup.
Yeah.
So the robots are, as they're revolting, basically.
Yeah.
You get Shia LaBeouf out there. So we didn't mention Shia LaBeouf. He only appears in it like twice. Once near the beginning, where he's talking some newfangled lingo to Will Smith, who doesn't understand what he's saying, which I found as I got older is much more and more true to life.
Yeah.
So Spooner on their way to USR sees Shia LaBeouf in trouble, and he does this slow-mo stunt where he jumps off his motorcycle, dual-wielding guns and shooting down the robots.
Yeah.
But then they eventually go on and they get back to USR. And when he asks how they're going to get inside, she says, I've got a man on the inside. Yeah. And Sonny opens it.
Because Sonny was supposed to be destroyed, and Lanning, after talking to... Calvin, after talking to Sonny, realises that he's unique and shouldn't be destroyed.
Yeah, so she had been given nanites to put in his brain, and she was being monitored by Vicky and by Robertson when she did it.
Yeah.
But we find out then that she used a decoy. She used a robot that hadn't been programmed yet, and she gave him the nanites instead, and she hid Sonny. Much like Dolores hides Roger Rabbit in the speakeasy in Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Yeah.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Roger Rabbit.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Trying to say that too fast. So this is where we find out the real twist, which is that when they go to find Robertson, they find Robertson is dead.
Yeah.
And the robots are still being controlled. So Spooner finally realizes
that the person who's actually behind it all is Vicky.
Yeah, and that's why he was brought into the case, because he is the only one who would suspect a robot.
Yeah. Back in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where we get the moment where Valiant realises, based on stuff that he'd learned earlier, that the weasels, whom they've all been captured now, the only way they can literally laugh themselves to death.
Yeah.
So he ends up doing a fantastic slapstick-esque show for them, to the point where they laugh and end up dying, which is an interesting sequence, because I remember one of them falling backwards and then trying to grab its own soul.
Yeah, the ghosts are coming up out of it, and it's trying to grab it and pull it back in.
And then that's when you find out between a battle between Judge Doom, who's trying to cut a hole from the wall of this property into the Toontown with this crazy contraption with like a giant fire hose on it that's going...
Yeah, so it's got like a pressurized hose and enough dip to destroy all of Toontown. And because they've got the pressurized hose and the bulldozer or the steamroller, they're planning to wipe out the whole of Toontown within minutes.
Because the conspiracy's gone that he is the sole benefactor of Cloverleaf.
Which is the company that has bought Toontown.
Well, he wants to buy Toontown, but he also bought the red.
The red car.
Red car, which is the public transport system for this whole idea that he's discovered plans that they're going to build a freeway, and instead of having Toontown there, he wants to have cheap hotels and restaurants and stuff.
Yeah, so that he makes all the money.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's going to be a freeway between LA and Pasadena, I believe.
Yeah.
And he wants to build an exit where Toontown is.
Yeah, so he wants to basically make a New Vegas area.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it's when he gets injured because he falls over and one of his eyes gets knocked out.
No, what?
And then he goes and hides to replace his eye. Then Valiant does all the singing and dancing and throwing bombs around in Acme traps because they're in the Acme warehouse. That's when all the weasels get killed through laughing themselves to death.
And what they accidentally, like in the process of dying, they turn on the steamroller and the pump, which is pointed at Jessica and Roger, who will die if it hits them. Yeah. So Eddie is trying to turn it off, and then Doom appears back in.
Yeah. And that goes into that sort of swashbuckling era of the older movies, where literally Judge Doom pulls a sword out of his cane, and then Valiant pulls out a singing sword, which is one of the Acme products. Yeah. And it's like I think it's like a Dean Martin, that sort of Rat Pack era reference. Right. Yeah. And they have this back and forth fight with all these props that are in the room, which are all like Toon props.
Yep. And then Doom ends up being steamrolled.
Steamrolled, yeah.
And then he gets up.
And then he blows himself back up.
He's a flat stop motion Doom.
Yeah, that's a fantastic sequence.
It's so good. It's so well done. Because obviously he's not. This is kind of the realization that he's a Toon. Yeah. But he is still in kind of human form, so that's why he's like this stop motion. And then he blows himself back up so that he is human, but it pops out his eyes, and you see these crazy red eyes. Yeah. Which is a callback to Eddie talking to Roger about his brother's death, where he says the Toon that killed him had crazy red eyes and
a high-pitched voice.
So then Doom starts to, turn on and go, "Don't you recognize me?" and goes into the high-pitched squeaky voice, and you realize this is the guy who killed Eddie's brother. Yeah. So this is how Eddie gets closure.
And they have a nice, interesting fight sequence again. And he ends up getting defeated by the dip getting spilled all over the floor, and it's sort of a very Wicked Witch of the West.
He's melting. And then because Eddie managed to get the dip to shoot out the back of the contraption, it lowers the pressure and it stops
just before it's going to kill Jessica and Roger. Yeah. And then he washes it all out with water. And
he breaks the fire hydrant to wash out the water, the stuff on the floor.
And then it ends up going through the wall anyway into Toontown, and as soon as it gets through the wall, it gets hit by a train, which I thought was like very classic cartoons from that era. You get the sort of the same. It's the real villain is revealed
right near the end.
The difference, obviously, that the fight sequence isn't there's just between Valiant and Doom, where in iRobot, Vicky has an entire army at her disposal.
Yeah, so they find Vicky. Vicky is basically, or her central complex is this weird. It's so strangely designed to the point that Will Smith's character Spooner does comment on how badly designed the room is, because they have to walk on these like narrow walkways over massive height, like 38 stories I think she says, and Vicky's down the bottom of it, but there's like a control panel up the top, and at the same time they've sent Sonny to go get the nanites to inject into her brain.
And because he's built special, Vicky says, I'm not going to lower the defense barrier. And he's like, well, my father made me.
Yeah, he says I've got denser alloy. Yeah. So he says, my father gave it to me. I think he wanted me to kill you.
Yeah, and reaches in and extracts the nanites, and then they have the cool fight sequence with he's literally, which would have been really difficult at that era to match up. And it has a little bit of the thing I don't like in movies, which they didn't do in The Matrix, where the action sequence, and the same with some of Zack Snyder's work, where they slow down the action and do that quick ramp and the boring bits, and then you see it. This is, because they're fighting at their real speed, it's very jarring from the audience's point of view, because they're doing actions, and because the Sonny and the rest of the NS5s are the same, it's quite confusing to which act is which. Well,
Okay.
from my point of view, it's the same with some of the other movies I've done, especially where I just don't like that style of action and fight sequences personally, because it's confusing to see which character's what and what is actually happening. It's the same issue I had with the Transformers movies.
Oh, okay. So Sonny is running through the corridor, and there's a cool moment where the NS5s are trying to ambush him, and he just jumps and spins through the middle of them like a drill. It's very cool. Which I know I wrote a note asking, did Alan Tudyk do this? Did he do this for real? Which he does have a stunt double, so I don't believe so. But there is behind the scenes footage of him doing some stunts, so, maybe.
Yeah.
And Vicky, because Vicky knows she's being threatened, suddenly calls back all the NS5s. So all the NS5s that are out enforcing curfew suddenly turn around and stare at the building, and then just walk up to it and start scaling it like spiders, and it's terrifying. And then they break through the glass and start fighting Calvin and Spooner inside there.
They have that moment of how long is it going to take to hack into Vicky's defense, and he's like, oh, about 6 minutes, and he looks at these robots crawling up the side of the building. He's like, we don't have 6 minutes.
Yeah, we're not going to have 6 minutes.
So the high point of the fight sequence between this giant army of NS5s and Spooner and Calvin and obviously Sonny turning up is she's about to die, she's about to fall, they've destroyed the walkway she's standing on, he's been disarmed but has fallen onto some support wires, and he's grabbed his gun back, and Sonny bursts in and he looks at what's happening from his point of view, and then looks at the target, which is Vicky's brain, and Spooner yells out to him, save the girl.
Yeah.
And he's he trusts Spooner enough, and he throws the nanites to him and then jumps down to save Vicky.
No, save Calvin.
And then Spooner jumps through the air and catches the nanites, and because of his cybernetic arm is able to grab hold of whatever the spinal column of her brain, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
And slide down and inject the nanites.
Yeah, and that's how he gets closure, is because he tells a robot to save someone else and not do the logical thing, and the robot does it. Yeah. Does what he says.
Because the survival, again, he it's that protocol of I'm supposed to do this, so that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
I like that end sequence. It's like, Sonny, she's fine, save me.
Yeah, it's good.
And then the reveal at the end is that Sonny actually did kill Lanning.
Yes. And Lanning had made him promise he would do it before he told him what he was making promises to do.
Yeah.
So he made him promise to do him one favour, and then the favour was kill him.
Yeah.
Because he knew that was the only way to get the investigation started. Because he was basically trapped by surveillance in that room because Vicky could see him everywhere. So that was his only escape, was to be killed and to call Spooner, who he knew would, be the one to chase Sonny and find out from Sonny what he needed to find out.
At the end of the Who Framed Roger Rabbit, it's still going to go, the tune, leaving the will is from Acme's will still missing, and then the ink that Acme had sprayed on Valiant when they were in the club is back on his stomach.
Yeah, so he had sprayed him with ink and then it disappeared. He said, it's disappearing ink.
And reappearing ink.
So now we find out it's also conveniently disappearing and reappearing ink.
And he's been carrying around a love
letter that Roger wrote to Jessica when Roger was mad, because rather than go kill Acme, what he did was he thought about how much he loved Jessica and wrote her a love letter.
Yeah.
But he said he went to her dressing room and she wasn't there, so he wrote her a love letter, and Valiant's like, what, did you use lipstick on a mirror? And he says, I did use lipstick, but there was this blank piece of paper lying around. So Valiant has the cha-ching moment where he realizes the blank piece of paper is the will, and he gets Roger to read out the love letter, and as he's reading it out, the will appears, and they find out that the Toontown has been left to the Toons.
Yeah, and they have the kissing sequence between Valiant and Roger, which shows that all his prejudice is gone.
Yeah.
at the end of iRobot, after the coups ended, and Vicky's been destroyed, and the NS5s are a massive recall, which is going to destroy There's so much because she explains in the movie that the defense contracts are all with NS5s, and there's no actual human soldiers anymore.
Yeah. So it's going to be a huge overhaul.
And I did the maths on this. So because there's a point where Robertson says 1 in 5 robots for every American. So if there was we'll say based on 380 Americans or 380 million Americans.
It's 380 Americans. There's only 380 out there. Listen to our podcast.
There'll be 76 million NS5s.
Right.
So therefore, at the end of the movie, they've been recalled. They're all going to the same storage units where the NS4s were taken.
Yeah.
And then you see the image again of Sonny standing on the hill.
Yeah. So when Sonny drew the hill originally, he drew his dream.
Yeah.
Because they believed that this landing secret was hidden in Sonny's dream.
Yeah.
And he drew a man on the hill overlooking all the robots.
Yeah. And
Dr. Calvin said, "Is the man on the hill you?" And he says, "Why do you ask that? Is that a common dream?"
Yeah.
And then after a conversation occurs, he says that it's going to make more sense to spoon it into him. And when they ask why, he says, "Because the man on the hill was not me.
Yeah.
It was you."
Yeah.
And that's why Spooner goes there. But at this moment, at the end, we see Sonny being the man on the hill.
Yeah. Which is to me, it's a very Moses-esque moment.
Yeah.
Where he's going to, stand there in the desert and he's going to lead his people to freedom.
Yes.
So there's that little bit of back and forth. He may be the robot messiah.
Yeah.
And you said there was because that would be open from the director and the production company's point of view, like an opening to a sequel, which they never got.
There seems to have been talk about a sequel, but it's never happened.
Yeah.
I imagine at this point it won't happen.
Yeah, it'd be a long hiatus between two movies.
Yeah.
You're like, what?
It's happened before. But, I can't see them doing another one. They'd have to do it before actual 2035 comes around because then it's in the past and not future anymore. So it's interesting. So one of the notes I'd written about this movie is that no reshoots were required, which was rare for a movie that size.
Yeah.
And just it was, I don't know. It's based on a whole load of different Isaac Asimov short stories. But the one I thought was interesting is that the one where Sonny's kind of brain comes from is a story called Catch That Rabbit. And I just thought that was cool for our purposes with this podcast.
Definitely. Box office ratings.
Yeah,
box office and ratings. Don't know why I merged those two together.
Box office ratings. So it's interesting because Who Framed Roger Rabbit had a budget of $70 million, and with that budget, it was the most expensive film produced in the 1980s.
Wow.
And it also, at the time of release, had the longest on-screen credits for any film.
Makes sense.
Which, I mean, I guess a lot of that budget went on licensing characters from both Disney and Warner Brothers.
And the animation, because that would have all been hand-drawn.
Yeah, the animation would have been, quite expensive. So it was a $70 million budget, and it made $329 million at box office. And it's rated 7.7 on IMDb. iRobot had a $120 million budget and got $353 million in the box office. IMDb rating of 7.1, so they're both decently high.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with that. I enjoy both movies.
Yeah.
This is one of the cases where we'd both seen both movies before.
Yeah, I own them both on DVD.
Yeah, and we didn't watch either of the DVDs because they're both on Disney
Plus.
So
I think I said that when we went. I was like, no, I'm gonna be lazy. Let's just watch it on Disney Plus.
Yeah, it's like because you said, oh, are they up on Netflix or somewhere, or will they use the DVDs? And I was like, actually, they're both on Disney Plus. Yeah. So we can use the DVDs or we can do Disney Plus. It's also the first, and it says and only as of 2021. So currently still only times. It's the first and only time that the cartoon characters from both Walt Disney and Warner Brothers appear on screen together.
Interesting.
Yep. This is my favourite note that I've written, which I know you enjoyed the first time we recorded this podcast. It was Bob Hoskins said, for 2 weeks after seeing the movie, his son wouldn't talk to him. And when he finally asked him why, his son said he couldn't believe that his dad would work with cartoon characters like Bugs Bunny, and he didn't let him meet them.
Yeah.
I just think that's so cute.
And I'm very hopeful that his child was at least single digits in age when he said that. Because if he wasn't, that's a bit disturbing.
Yeah. No, it's adorable.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a whole lot of the notes I had written, because a whole lot of the notes that are on the IMDb trivia are about the different characters that were, or the different actors that were considered to play different roles.
Yeah.
First of all, so this isn't actually actor-wise, well, it is actor-wise, it's not consideration. Someone who actually played the role is Jessica Rabbit's speaking voice is Kathleen Turner, and her singing voice is Amy Irving, but on the credits, only Amy Irving was credited. So Kathleen Turner didn't get a credit, even though she did the speaking voice. But I think most people know nowadays that it is. The big notes for actors who were considered for the role was Tim Curry auditioned for the role of Judge Doom, but they thought his performance was too terrifying, so he didn't get the role. And the other big one was that Robert Zemeckis and Steven Spielberg wanted Bill Murray to play Eddie Valiant, but they couldn't
get a hold of him.
Yeah, they couldn't get in contact with him, and they said this in a newspaper interview, or Zemeckis said it in a newspaper interview, and Bill Murray read that newspaper interview while he was in a public place, and he said he just screamed his lungs out because he would have accepted it in an instant. But they hadn't been able to get in contact with him.
That's when you fire your agent, folks.
Yeah. So there's a whole load. So I'll go with the shorter lists first. So for Roger Rabbit, the other considerations were Paul Rubens and Eddie Deason. So Eddie Deason plays Mandark on Dexter's Lab. Would have been an interesting voice for him.
And like I said last time, and I'll say it again, I think Bobcat
Goldthwait.
Yeah, it would have been better.
It would have been a great,
Roger Rabbit.
Yeah, I can just imagine. I don't know. I feel like he'd be great as a different character. I don't know if he'd work as Roger, because Roger's too optimistic.
Maybe.
He's great in Hercules. Where he's which of them is he? Panic? I think he's Pain.
Pain, yeah.
Yeah. And it's so well done. So for Judge Doom, they either considered or auditioned Tim Curry, Robin Williams, Sting, Roddy McDowall, Sir Christopher Lee, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then John Cleese professed that he was interested in the role, but they turned him down.
Yeah, because they didn't want it to be related to Monty Python at all.
And for Valiant, there is just a ridiculous list. So we kept listing these individually. You'd be like, this person was considered for the role of Eddie Valiant. This person was over and over again. So these are all people who either were considered or did audition, or I guess both.
Yeah.
So Bill Murray, obviously. Robin Williams again, because he was considered for both Doom and Valiant. Eddie Murphy. Wallace Shawn, Harrison Ford was their first choice. I think
Eddie Murphy would have been a fantastic pick for this.
Yeah. And then we would have been talking about two movies about black men being racist.
Yeah.
Eddie Murphy as Valiant would have been a really interesting choice. Harrison Ford was their first choice, which I thought was interesting. Because I feel like Bob Hoskins, as he plays Valiant, is quite similar to how I can imagine Harrison Ford playing him. You know what I mean? Is that kind of stoic? Robert Redford, Sylvester Stallone, Jack Nicholson, Ed Harris, Peter Renaday, Charles Grodin, Dan Aykroyd, Don Lane, Rowan Atkinson, Chevy Chase, Danny DeVito, John Travolta, Tom Hanks, Mickey Rourke, Richard Gere, Michael Keaton, Dudley Moore, Michael Biehn, Gene Hackman, Joe Pesci, Robert De Niro, Kurt Russell.
So I think we cheat from now on when it comes to 6 Degrees, and we use the
could-have-beens.
The could-have-beens from Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yeah, it's a weird one. Can you imagine John Travolta as Eddie Valiant?
There's people in that list you just mentioned that I could... Mickey Rourke?
Yeah, Mickey Rourke.
That's so bizarre.
Michael Keaton? I could see Michael Keaton do it.
Yeah.
Especially in that era.
I'm a huge fan of Michael Keaton.
I would watch any movie with Michael Keaton in it. Kurt Russell, you like Kurt Russell.
Yeah.
Anyway, we don't want to go too much into it. I know Terry Gilliam also was offered the job of directing the movie, but he said it is conceptually unauthentic to use the Looney Tunes genre and character stable as a springboard for a variation on the Howard the Duck story.
Yeah.
Fair enough. If that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. Apparently also Charles Fleischer, who did voice Roger Rabbit, insisted on wearing a Roger Rabbit suit while voicing the character.
That's weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Bob Hoskins in a documentary refers to him as completely nuts. But yeah, so it's interesting.
He's not had a great career, unfortunately.
Bob Hoskins?
Yes.
Do you know he was the number one consideration for Wolverine in the original X-Men series?
Wow.
Can you imagine? Because he's the right height for it. Wolverine is supposed to be like 5'3".
5'5", yeah.
Is it 5'5"? It's 5'3".
Yeah.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Shorter than Hugh Jackman, anyway.
Yeah, because Hugh Jackman's like 6'2". And
I saw
lanky.
someone like Photoshop. I think it's literally a picture from Who Framed Roger Rabbit where you can see his hairy chest, and they photoshopped in the adamantium claws and stuff.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into a giant rant about Wolverine. I wish I could, but it's not the right time.
Okay.
I think that's all we've got, folks. We'll
I'll see. Was there anything else that I had?
That's all, folks.
Yes, I thought that's what you were doing. Yeah. So I mean, the only other thing I think, because I think we went through all of my points about them being the same stuff. The one thing I thought was interesting was that they use the nanites that were originally meant to kill Sonny to kill Vicky, and in the other movie they used the dip that Doom.
Roger.
He was trying to use Roger, trying to kill Roger with the dip, and they kill Doom with the same dip.
Yeah.
So in both of them, the villain ends up being. First of all, the villain ends up actually being the thing that the person is prejudiced against.
Yeah.
Even though in both movies they kind of end their prejudice at the end.
Yeah.
But they use the tools that were supposed to kill the framed person to kill the real villain. Yeah. Which I think is a nice touch. So if there's nothing else to add, I guess we'll do our sign off.
Yeah.
Okay. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at ittakes2_pod, or on Facebook at ittakes2pod, or you can check out our website on ittakes2.co.nz.
Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you, catch you next time.
Goodbye.
On the Vintage Video Podcast, we'll be reviewing every single wide release of the 1980s in chronological order. Over 250 episodes to enjoy and thousands more to come. John enters the store now to order another can of ether. I picture him outside like Homer with the gasohol.
One for you, one for me.
I also like to think about that the kids renew their vow not to talk about the murder
by murdering someone.
They're taking a blood oath with someone else's blood.
This stuff is 7 times more powerful than uranium. And they open up the vault that it's contained in, not wearing any kind of protective gear.
Yeah.
And it's wooden crates.
Wooden crates. It's like the guys in Chernobyl picking up the graphite rocks and going, because there's rocks.
Hugging the elephant foot. Just like, oh, this thing's smooth.
It's so warm.
He turns to dial the number from the classified ad without even thinking about the numbers. We know this because we can hear his thoughts, and he's talking about how AJ was right that ninjas are misdirecting him.
They're misdirecting.
I really wish that he'd turn to the phone and been like, 665. No, that's 2 5s. Vintage Video. We're rewatching the 80s so you don't have to.